again. This lecture is about Irving Berlin, probably one of America's most popular songwriters, and the composer of a lot of independent individual songs, as opposed to larger scores. Nonetheless, his contribution is pretty strong to the American musical, and we wind up talking about him particularly in light of a couple of real groundbreaking shows that came later in his career. Irving Berlin, as you can see here, was born in 1888 and died in 1989. Yep, Irving Berlin lived forever. Irving Berlin lived 101 years. He lived long enough to be around for the first talking motion pictures and still to be around to see Star Wars in 1976. Irving Berlin lived long enough to help be one of the shaping pioneers of ragtime music and still be around in 1983 to collect an honorary Grammy at the same stage as Michael Jackson. Irving Berlin lived such a long and varied life that I guess that might be part of why the number of compositions, when you look at an Irving Berlin song, or you go looking for one, as we'll probably do another of those discussion groups where I ask you to find me one, shouldn't be too hard, because there are a trove of Irving Berlin songs. Berlin's also one of those people that seems to have written an awful lot of music that people kind of take for granted as like America's music, as our own. I don't think we really think about it as stuff that one individual had to, at some point, as with every song, sit down and write. And with Berlin, that's really, really the case. I want to talk to you a little bit about his life and a little bit about how he came to America. Like I said, he was born in 1888, and in 1892, a pogrom by the Cossacks, the Russians. He was born in Termun, Russia. A lot of political activity drove his family to America. A lot of very difficult times, especially for Jewish families in the latter half of the 1800s in Russia. He settled in New York City's East Side with his family, and he and all of his brothers went out selling newspapers and providing other small services while their father ran a deli in New York City. His public education was very brief. When he was about 9, his father passed away. He ran away from home and decided he wanted to be on his own. He wound up leading a blind singer around New York City's Bowery section into saloons, and was paid money by the singer, who he has always kept anonymous in his biographies, just to take him around town. He wound up working as a pianist in a cafe in New York, and went from there uptown. And in 1911, he wrote the music and words, a practice that he would follow for pretty much all of his life. Berlin is one of these folks who was both a composer and a lyricist. Anyhow, he wrote the music and words for a song in 1911, a song called Alexander's Ragtime Band. He was working at the time for another of those Tin Pan Alley music companies, and with Alexander's Ragtime Band, he had not just a hit, but a mega hit. The sort of successful song that changed just the shape of popular American music at the time by introducing this concept, or at least championing it, of ragtime, of what we call syncopation in music. That's a slippery term to try to explain outright. You kind of know it when you hear it. If you listen to some of the pianist Scott Joplin, or really any recording of Alexander's Ragtime Band, you get a little bit of what ragtime sounds like. Ragtime, for lack of a better way to explain it, is sort of the art of avoiding the beat. You will hear major notes that are part of the melody taken on the offbeat of the general beat of music. What that tends to do is it tends to draw attention to the times when there is a strong beat, and it tends to make the beat sound urgent. It also kind of front loads the beat. I really recommend, in fact, I'll probably, although it's not a Berlin composition, I will probably add another link for you to this lecture to something like Maple Leaf Rag, just so that you can hear a little bit of a really perfect example of syncopated ragtime. It's also the sort of thing you hear a lot in player pianos, and certainly you've probably heard this and associated it with this time period. For Berlin, Alexander's Ragtime Band was more than a little bit of a hit. It was a huge hit. It sold millions and millions of copies of sheet music. It sold independent recordings, some of the earliest to successfully be bestsellers. And Berlin kind of followed it up, just like any pop star even today. You see other songs after this, like Everybody's Doing the Rag, and That Mysterious Rag, and Let's Do the Ragtime Again, and things like that, that kind of just did the same song. Said, well, people liked it once, maybe they'll like it again. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about a tragedy in Berlin's life and how it led to another important song. Berlin had been madly in love with a woman that her father did not really want him to marry. In this particular case, he decided nonetheless that he would run away and he would marry this person. And unfortunately, on their honeymoon, his would-be wife, Dorothy, contracted malaria and died. So that must have been kind of tough to explain to the dad back home who didn't want him to get married in the first place. This story led him to write a song called When I Lost You. And the song also became a very, very big financial hit, perhaps powered in part by the story of the tragedy behind the song. Really, these independent songs are kind of examples of Berlin making a lot of money off of individual tunes. He served in the war, in World War II, and wrote music for soldiers. Wrote a lot of musicals that the soldiers could participate in. A show called Yip Yip Yap Hank, I believe was the name of it. Things like that kind of were designed with songs like This Is the Army, Mr. Jones, that are kind of designed to be very patriotic, but also kind of fun, and certainly for casts of all male, of all men to play as soldiers. After the war, Berlin extended his activities to the point where he became kind of a one-man trust of popular music. He began to put some of his money into his own publishing firm on Tin Pan Alley. Among the big 8, eventually Irving Berlin Publishers would be one of those 8. And with Berlin's case, this was one of the few companies where a songwriter himself, who had been in the trenches, who had written these songs, was now also the manager of one of these companies. And he made quite a bit of money from that. He became a victim of the economic crisis that ravaged the country in 1929 and was left pretty much penniless. To make matters even worse, he lapsed into a period then of creative inactivity, a sort of a severe writer's block, and finally recovered in 1931 with a few hits for a Broadway revue called Face the Music. He kind of swore after that. He said he would never again put all of his money in one place, and he would never again be penniless, and he never again was. Berlin kind of wound up at the top of his profession and staying there for the rest of the time. In a few moments, I'm going to tell you 2 major stories of the composition of 2 of Berlin's biggest hits. 2 songs that everyone knows, and that I think we kind of associate as just kind of the public trust of music. Both of them have really interesting anecdotes behind them. And we're going to talk, yes, Berlin was a part of musicals, and we are going to talk about a musical that he worked on. Many Berlin musicals are really just collections of his songs, excuses to take already existing hit songs and kind of put them on stage. And in some cases, there's not much of a plot. It's more of just a collection of those songs. And sometimes a song might appear in more than one of these old Berlin shows. There is one Berlin show we'll talk about called Annie Get Your Gun, however, that has one set score and that holds together as one cohesive piece pretty well. And I'll chat with you about that a little bit. So this will bring to a close section 1 of our lecture here. You might, if you want to do this in just the right order, give a listen to perhaps some of the ragtime stuff that should be linked with this module. But then when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about those 2 great and wonderful songs that have such a fascinating story behind them.